Bleav in Vikings is on the air for today, Monday, August 5th, and I'm your host, Mike Wobschall, ready to talk football and kick off another week of training camp for the Minnesota Vikings. Now, I remember these days of camp. I was with the Vikings for 15 years on the inside. You're no longer in the camp is just beginning phase, the honeymoon phase of training camp. Right now, you are firmly entrenched in the routine and the grind of training camp, but you're still a good week's worth and week's time away from that first preseason game. So you're not focusing on the light at the end of the tunnel yet. You're square in the middle of the dog days of training camp. And for those who can embrace the grind and can be comfortable being uncomfortable, this is a really fun and rewarding part of the NFL calendar, the dog days of training camp. Lots to get to on today's show. We are going to get into a few logistical and schedule updates right at the top, but then we'll get a handle on the quarterback competition, a few comments there from yours truly based on some things that Vikings head coach Kevin O'Connell has said. We'll get a firm prediction or two or three from yours truly on players making the roster and the starting lineup. Some injury updates from Vikings training camp. The first position battle is officially over. Some commentary and some statistics about that. And then an early favorite for Mr. Mankato in 2024. So stay tuned for that. Mr. Mankato early favorite. That'll be at the end of the show. First, though, let's take care of some business. Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything online sports betting. Right now, you can receive a 50% free bet of up to $250 on your first deposit to bet on anything from the Olympics to baseball to Formula One racing. Bet Online has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. When the game's over, head on over to the online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind with one of their over 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. Use promo code BLEAV, BLEAV, for your 50% free bet credit on your first deposit up to $250. Bet Online. The game starts here. Logistical scheduling update for Vikings training camp. They were originally scheduled to practice this evening, Monday evening, in front of the fans inside the outdoor stadium at TCO Performance Center in Eagan, but because of weather, the team canceled/postponed that practice, moved it to August 12th, and so there will be no Vikings work or practice at all today at TCO Performance Center in Eagan. Instead, the team has shifted its off day, which was Tuesday, to today, and then they'll have a full practice on Tuesday. So a little bit of a slower news cycle day here for the Vikings, at least you hope so, with the Players' Day off on Monday, August 5th at training camp. So we're here to sort of recap what we've seen in training camp so far and talk about how what we've seen is informing what the opinions are as we head into week 2 of training camp for the Vikings and get ready for the team to have those intra-squad practices with the Cleveland Browns in advance of the Vikings-Browns preseason game over the weekend. Let's begin with getting a handle on the quarterback situation for the Minnesota Vikings, because it's been Sam Darnold the whole way as the starter for the Vikings heading into the 2024 season, but you have this hype of J.J. McCarthy being a first-round pick, the ordained quarterback of the future, and so there's always that possibility or that hope that he's going to end up being the starting quarterback as soon as week 1 of the regular season. And so, I think we have to acknowledge that there's probably a, predetermined outcome, manifest destiny, confirmation bias in more than 50% of those following or covering the team that McCarthy will be or could be the starter. But as is so often the case, reality is not always aligned with what those external expectations are, right? And I think that's happening here in this case, where the intent all along, it appears to me, is that Sam Darnold will be the starter and J.J. McCarthy will be the backup for the 2024 season. And if things change during the course of the season, then things change. But the intent is to have Sam Darnold, the veteran, be the starter and not have that pressure on McCarthy to start as soon as week 1. And I don't think anything that's happened in the offseason program or training camp has really shifted that expectation for Kevin O'Connell and for the coaches. O'Connell has been equally positive and equally critical about Darnold and JJ McCarthy, and that's been the case all along. But it's not been the type of reaction, the type of feedback, the type of performance at Vikings camp that has slammed the door shut on JJ McCarthy potentially winning that job. There are flashes of McCarthy doing well that fans are tweeting about, that reporters are reporting on, where that door is cracked slightly open for JJ McCarthy to be the starter. I have to give credit to Kevin O'Connell. I don't think he's tipped his hand. I don't think he's given any indication as to which way he's leaning. Granted, I don't think he's made a decision. I think all he has to date is the intention, which I've already explained, the intention to sign a veteran, have him be the starter, and then to draft someone high in this year's draft. And that's exactly what they did. They signed Sam Darnold in free agency. They drafted JJ McCarthy during the draft. And then they went into the offseason program. They went into training camp with Darnold as the starter, the presumed starter, McCarthy as the backup. I have a feeling the practices this week and then the joint practices with the Browns, the game against the Browns, and then the practices leading up to preseason game number 2, I think that's where the decision is going to be made by Kevin O'Connell and the Vikings. So we'll have to wait and see what the results are, particularly of those joint practices with the Browns. I think if McCarthy shows out and it remains sort of an even race, it's advantage McCarthy. However, I think it's a great opportunity for Sam Darnold to lean on his experience in the league, having been a starter already and having experience playing against NFL caliber defenses. It's an opportunity for Darnold to lean on those experiences, that maturity, to separate himself from McCarthy during this week of practices leading up to the Browns, and then while practicing and playing against the Browns and then preparing for preseason game number 2. This is Darnold's opportunity to create separation. But I don't think the door is completely shut on McCarthy being the starter. And I will also say, you want as much information and as much time as you can give to this decision, you want to give that so that you make the best, most informed decision. But there comes a point in time here in August where you're doing a disservice to whoever ends up being the starter. You're doing a disservice to them by prolonging the decision, because at some point you need to be like, this is our starter and he's getting the lion's share of the reps. He's going against the first team defense all the time. He's playing with the first team offense, the first team offensive line all the time. At some point, you got to flip that switch, make that call, and give whoever the starter is going to be the lion's share of the reps. And I think that point will come for Kevin O'Connell at some point in the next 10 days, 8, 9, 10 days, as they're preparing for the Browns, practicing against the Browns, and playing against the Browns. I think it will become clear to Kevin O'Connell who he should name as his week 1 starter. Now, he may not announce that because it could be a distraction, but it'll become clear in his mind over the next 8 to 10 days who the starter is going to be for week 1 of the regular season. I expect it'll be Sam Darnold, but I'm leaving the door slightly cracked open for the chance that it could be JJ McCarthy. Okay, for the main talker of today's episode of Bleav in Vikings, it's the numbers game when it comes to building the 53-man roster and some roster predictions. I remember 15 years with the Vikings, every year at this time, training camps in Mankato, training camps in Eagan, you're sitting there doing you're literally counting your fingers, doing the numbers game. It's how many linebackers are we going to keep? Which ones? Is it 6 linebackers or 7? Is it 3 running backs or 4? Are we going to keep 4 safeties or 5? Is it going to be 6 corners or 5? And there's just a certain number of guys that you can have at every position. You're counting them out. Who's it going to be on the sideline as you're watching practice? And so while I'm not watching practice on the sidelines, as I used to be doing that numbers game with Voice of the Vikings, Paul Allen, I'm still doing it from where I'm at here as we're observing practice highlights, as we're reading reports from TCO Performance Center from media members who are there covering it, as you're listening and watching press conferences of coaches and players. You're sitting there keeping an internal count of the roster and who's making the team and who's going to be a starter and who are going to be the key backups. And I've got some observations and some conclusions as we sit here on Monday, August 5th, well in advance yet of the roster cutdown. I believe it's the 27th. So, we're 22 days away from roster cutdown, but decisions become clear and likelihoods become apparent. And I've got a few of them that we're going to go over right now. Let's start in the secondary, particularly the Vikings cornerback room, where there's obviously been some changes because of tragic losses and injuries in that room. So I think the top four corners for the Vikings are going to be Byron Murphy Jr., Shaq Griffin, presuming he gets back to being healthy, Fabian Moreau, and Bobby McCain, two recent free agent signings. Fabian Moreau, Bobby McCain, Byron Murphy, Shaq Griffin. Those are your top four corners entering the season. I believe they'll get the most snaps at the cornerback position. When there are three receivers on the field, Murphy goes into the slot. Griffin and Moreau / McCain are on the outside. Murphy's one of your top two corners. Probably Shaq Griffin or Bobby McCain is the other top corner. But Murphy, Griffin, Moreau, McCain, top four corners. Top three safeties: Harrison Smith, Cam Bynum, Josh Metellus, of course. So there's your top seven defensive backs. Jay Ward and Theo Jackson will make this team. They have position flexibility within the secondary, as do Bobby McCain. And I think, Metellus obviously has a ton of flexibility as well. So I think you can cross-train Jay Ward and Bobby McCain as safeties corners and Theo Jackson as safeties corner big nickel. But those are your top nine: Murphy, Griffin, Moreau, McCain, Ward, Jackson, Harry, Bynum, Metellus. That's 9. I would say you can count on 10, maybe in some years 11 if you're super deep and you don't want to lose a good player. Maybe 11, but typically 10 defensive backs on your roster. And I think 9 are pretty clear. Those 9 are pretty clear, which leaves 1, maybe 2 spots for the following 8 players on the depth chart. Lewis Seen, a draft pick from just a couple years ago, first-round pick. Dwight McGlothern, Caleb Evans, Andrew Booth Jr., Najee Thompson, Duke Shelley, Jalen Williams, A.J. Green, Jacoby Francis. Only 1 or 2 of those guys is going to make the 53-man roster, guys. So the Vikings have thick competition for just 1 or 2 spots. Granted, they're very bottom of the roster spots, but there's still spots on a 53-man roster. So despite all these injuries in the cornerback room, and I'm going to talk more in full about this later in the week, but despite the injuries at the cornerback room, Vikings not in bad shape in the secondary. I don't mind what they've got going on there, and it's buoyed by a really strong, versatile, smart safety room. But 9 spots are already spoken for, I do believe, in the secondary. 1 to 2 remain. Going to the offensive side of the ball, C.J. Ham, fullback. In today's NFL, the fullback position is precarious. Not every team keeps one. It used to be one that every team had 1 or 2 of them. But now some teams don't carry one. The teams that do, they're getting fewer and further between. The Vikings, I believe, will be one of them. And I think at surface level, it's, you're thinking Kevin O'Connell, offensive-minded, played quarterback, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, going to open it up, lots of passing, don't need a fullback. But I actually think the Vikings have sort of shifted from an 11 personnel team to really wanting to be a 12 and 22 personnel team, which means 1 back and 2 tight ends, 2 backs and 2 tight ends. So I think there's absolutely a spot for CJ Ham on this roster. In fact, I'm virtually certain of it, so confident that I will predict right now CJ Ham makes this team. And I think inside the walls of TCO Performance Center, they hear that and they're like, well, no duh, he's making the team. But not everyone assumes that in the NFL these days. The way Kevin O'Connell spoke about CJ Ham last week in a press conference, and knowing what I know about CJ Ham and what he can do for a team, I think he's making the team. He can help in the passing game. He can help in the running game, obviously, as a lead blocker. He can help in the kicking game as a core special teams player for you. He's a great leader, a great teammate. So I think CJ Ham on the roster, count him as one of the 53 players. Wide receiver, Jalen Nailor, in. Again, not a shock or a surprise to anyone inside the walls of TCO Performance Center, but that's not the audience for this podcast. The audience for this podcast and show are those on the outside who are trying to get a glimpse inside. Jalen Nailor, wide receiver, in, having a great camp. So it'll be Jefferson, Addison, Powell, Sherfield, and Nailor. Those are the 5 I see on the 53-man roster for sure right now. That leaves one spot possibly. Some teams do carry 6 wide receivers. Rarely do you see 7. It's 5 or 6. I think the 5 are Jefferson, Addison, Powell, Sherfield, Nailor. Those 5 are in. Who is in after that? Not really sure. One of the Jacksons could be in. I really like Jeshwan Jones. I thought he was a great undrafted free agent for the Vikings. And I know he's been injured. He's older than most rookies are at this stage in their careers. There's a lot to like, I think, about Jeshwan Jones, so I'm rooting for him to make the team or the practice squad. Go back to the defensive side of the ball here, and we go up front to the defensive line. Jonathan Bullard and Gabriel Murphy, count them in, both of them in on your rosters. Learned Vikings fans, those inside the building, again, no brainers here. Bullard, a veteran and versatile. Love the way Brian Flores has talked about him, and he got a Veterans Day off last week. Another pretty solid indication that he'll be in. Gabriel Murphy was probably one of the more sought-after undrafted free agents this year. Great pass rusher out of UCLA, and he's got some versatility. So I heard Brian Flores and Kevin O'Connell both talk about Murphy's versatility as a pass rusher and where they can move him in the pass rushing games and schemes. So count Bullard and Murphy in on the defensive line for roster predictions. And then a starting lineup prediction, Blake Brandel has, it's apparent to me that he will be the starting left guard, which opens up an interesting situation at right guard for the Minnesota Vikings, where Ed Ingram is the incumbent starter at right guard. However, the Vikings also re-signed and brought back Dalton Risner, who started a bunch of games for them last season. And in my view, would definitely represent an upgrade over Ingram. However, with Brandel slated to be the starter and looking solid as a starter at left guard, I'm wondering if the upgrade that Risner represents over Ingram as a starting right guard, what is that? How do you weigh that against the value that Risner has as your key swing guard who can come in if someone is injured or is having a bad game and can replace either the left guard or the right guard? I think Risner has great value in that regard. And so it's an interesting decision for the Vikings where it's like, we've been disappointed in Ed Ingram as a starting right guard to date. Do we continue his development, give him reps, and see if we can get him to improve? Or do we cut our losses, make him a backup / reserve, and insert Risner as the starter, but lose the value of Risner as a key backup, as a swing backup, left guard, right guard? So interesting call there for the Vikings to make during the training camp and preseason stage of the season. I don't think they know which way they're going to go. I think if you have to win a game right now, you would play Risner over Ingram. But you have the long play in mind as well, where you're trying to develop Ingram as a starter. And you have value with Risner as a key reserve. So interesting situation there for the Vikings to sort of to decide on and to go through during training camp and the preseason. Let's go to some news, notes, and updates here and start with injuries. We'll run through a bunch of topics here before we close the show for today. Injury updates from Vikings training camp middle and late last week. Lewis Cine has missed some time here in training camp. It's a lower leg injury for Cine, just the latest reason that he's missed time for the Vikings. You know, obviously he missed most of his rookie season because of that devastating leg injury he suffered in week 4, compound fracture to his leg. Awful to see, and you hate seeing that for a player, especially with someone who had as much promise as Lewis Cine had. As mentioned earlier, the Vikings are in great shape at the safety position with Harrison Smith and Cam Bynum, Josh Metellus, Theo Jackson, Jay Ward, Bobby McCain can cross-train there. So a lot of great talent and depth for the Vikings in this room, which does not help Lewis Cine as he looks to make a recovery from yet another injury. I think Lewis Cine is a long shot to make the team this year. Practice squad, perhaps, whatever eligibility he has left for that. That's a possibility for Lewis Cine, but more so for Lewis Cine, I hope he gets back to the field and becomes fully healthy, impresses the Vikings in camp, and has a good shot to make the roster, but more so impresses teams during the preseason. Maybe he impresses the Cleveland Browns in those joint practices and their preseason game. And then he puts great preseason tape out there for all the teams to notice over the course of 3 preseason games here for the Vikings. Because I wish nothing for the best for Lewis Cine, but I think it's an uphill battle for him to make this roster at the safety position, especially since I don't know that he can cross-train as a big nickel or cross-train as a corner, which a lot of the people with whom he's competing for a roster spot can do. Shaq Griffin's return still unknown. Timetable not really set. Doesn't seem imminent for his return. I didn't sense from Kevin O'Connell that he was about to be back in the action. Kevin O'Connell mentioned a couple of times that he's hoping he can get back onto the field to do some work on the side. So that tells me he's a week or 2 weeks away. And that's not awesome because he's a veteran, but he's new to this team and new to this scheme specific to the Vikings. So now I will say Kevin O'Connell didn't seem concerned that there would be a problem of getting Shaq Griffin up to speed when it came to the playbook and the scheme. So that's good. But this soft tissue injury lingers for Shaq Griffin. I hope that his return is going to happen soon. Would love for the Vikings to get him back onto the field, but certainly no reason to think that his return is imminent. Would be awesome to get him back for those joint practices in Cleveland, but again, not something I anticipate. And then lastly, on the injury front, I think the Vikings dodge a bullet with Robert Tonyan because there were reports that he was down and injured, and then he was getting carted off the field. So you could just kind of fear the worst, especially with the Vikings having some bad luck on the injury front so far during training camp, particularly with the cornerback room with losing Mekhi Blackman and then, of course, Shaq Griffin, who we just talked about. But I do think the Vikings dodge a bullet there because it's back spasms for Robert Tonyan, according to Kevin O'Connell, which is not a minor injury that you can overlook. Anyone who's ever hurt their back or dealt with a sore back or back spasms knows that that's not a fun thing to deal with, and it can be debilitating. But I think in the grand scheme of things, that's something that you can get a player back from, and he can go on and have a good season for you. So good news there for the Vikings with Robert Tonyan seemingly having avoided serious injury and could be back in action soon for the Vikings. And they're going to need Tonyan and all the tight ends all hands on deck as they wait for TJ Hawkinson to get back from his knee injury suffered at the end of last season. The first position battle officially over for the Minnesota Vikings during training camp, and that position battle was the place-kicking battle that was being waged between Will Reichard and John Parker Romo. No surprise that Reichard won the battle. He's a 6th-round draft pick of the team this year, but maybe a little surprising that it happened so soon in training camp. I think a factor was actually the injuries to the cornerback room because the Vikings had to add a bunch of players, obviously. They signed like 3 corners in the matter of 10 days and had to create roster spots for them. So John Parker Romo is released, and that's one of those roster spots. But I think independent of all of that, the Vikings seemed ready to give the job to Reichard after he won that job over the course of the offseason program and the early stages of training camp. So Will Reichard will be the Vikings place kicker this season. And I think it's in, the Vikings' latest attempt to solve for the long term, the place kicking position, something they haven't done in, I don't know, when was the last long-term Vikings kicker? I think we thought it was going to be Blair Walsh, but then he fell off after a couple of seasons. So Will Reichard is the Vikings' latest chance to do that, and he's had a very good training camp, according to Kevin Seifert, 12 of 14 in team drills so far during training camp. Now, the focus for Reichard will be not on winning that competition because he's now done that. It'll be on preparing for the season, and that's not just those kicks in team periods where there's a little more pressure, but it's going down to US Bank Stadium, kicking there in the environment you will call home for hopefully what will be a long career, but certainly for the 2024 season. So look for reports about Reichard and the specialists going to US Bank Stadium to kick in that environment and get used to the conditions there. I mentioned the early favorite for Mr. Mankato. For those not familiar, obviously Vikings training camp used to be held in Mankato, Minnesota, which was the University of Minnesota at Mankato, formerly called Mankato State University. And so what would happen is there would be an unexpected standout player every year in training camp, and there could sometimes be a handful of them or multiple of them. And so media would get together and vote on the one who was the most impressive unexpected standout player and call him Mr. Mankato. And so even though the team is now in Eagan and no longer in Mankato, there's still a Mr. Mankato at training camp. And I know it's something that fans like to sort of pay attention to, and you tab someone Mr. Mankato every year. I think right now there are a couple of really good candidates. Theo Jackson certainly is one of them. But I'm going to say the early favorite for Mr. Mankato in 2024 is wide receiver Jalen Nailor. We talked about him earlier in the show when I predicted he would be one of 5 Vikings receivers who make the roster. He would be the 5th one. Jalen Nailor, again, praised by Kevin O'Connell for versatility. He can play inside. They're lining him up as a slot receiver at times. He can play outside. He's making plays down the field. He's making plays in the red zone. He's catching balls from McCarthy and from Darnold. So having a really good, solid camp. Kudos to Jalen Nailor for that. Hopefully he can keep it up. Now, wide receiver 3, there is competition going on there. So I'm saying he's the 5th receiver to make it. That's just right now. I think if he continues to have this type of training camp, can transition that or can transfer that to the preseason, maybe he climbs the depth chart a little bit and challenges Trent Sherfield Sr. and Brandon Powell for some snaps and some playing time as the WR3 or WR4. More to come on that. But an important position for the Vikings, especially with TJ Hawkinson out and not expected by me to be back until after the bye. There are certainly some reps to be parsed out there and to be won. Jalen Nailor making a good case to earn some of those reps here during training camp. Last thing, a programming note. Bryant McKinney will be a weekly guest here on Bleav in Vikings. You guys already know that. It's going to be a Monday or Tuesday weekly appearance for Bryant McKinney, former Vikings left tackle, a Super Bowl winner with the Baltimore Ravens, someone who I really enjoyed being teammates with as a member of the Vikings organization. We were together from 2005 to 10 or 11, his final season with the Vikings before he went to the Ravens, along with Matt Burke, and won a Super Bowl there. So really excited for Bryant to remain a part of Bleav in Vikings on the Bleav Network. He'll be a weekly guest on Mondays or Tuesdays. Working with him right now to get his debut appearance in the 2024 season on Bleav in Vikings at some point this week. I know he's traveling back from Minnesota to, I presume, Florida. So hoping to get together with him and chat about that and then get him on his first episode of the 2024 season here on Bleav in Vikings at some point later this week. That's going to do it for this episode of Bleav in Vikings, Monday, August 5th. We'll be back every day the rest of this week as we continue our coverage and observations of the Minnesota Vikings during training camp at TCO Performance Center in Eagan. This should be a pretty fun, active week. Although today's an off day for the team, it'll be busy from here on out because they'll be back to their practice schedule and routine. Then they'll be preparing for the Browns, practicing against the Browns, and playing against the Cleveland Browns next weekend. So really an exciting part of training camp. It's the dog days of training camp for these NFL teams as they really dig their heels and their claws in and get ready for the regular season. Kevin O'Connell making a concerted effort to, while keeping his players healthy and safe, have some physical, tough practices to instill that demeanor and that attitude and that brand of football in his team. A very smart move, I think, for Kevin O'Connell, because the 2024 season in the NFC North is set to be brutal. The competition will be great. The defending champion Detroit Lions are a physical, brute force football team. That's the brand that they have. That's the style of play that they have. So the Vikings are smart to try and match that. And I think Kevin O'Connell is doing a good job of that here during training camp. So we'll be back tomorrow on Tuesday and every day this week to talk more about that. Remember, there are ways you can participate and interact with us here on Bleav in Vikings. Please email me your questions, comments, and thoughts. At.Wobby@gmail.com. Every email gets an answer, and some of the emails will be used in the show. You can find me on Twitter, @Wobby, WOBBY. Come and find me on X/Twitter. Interact with us there. And then you can also find me on TikTok. We post some clips from the show on TikTok. I love interacting with you all on TikTok. We post fun videos. We post serious videos. My name is at the bottom of the screen there, Mike Wobschall. That's the TikTok handle for yours truly, @Mike Wobschall on TikTok. That's going to do it for today's show, everyone. We thank you for listening. We encourage you to like, follow, and subscribe. Bleav in Vikings. You can do that wherever you do it with all your other favorite football podcasts. We are on all the major podcasting networks, and we're also on YouTube. So follow us there. Once you do, we'll see you there. That's it for today, everybody. Until next time, always remember, keep believing.